had to do two things. I was like sort of also looking at
Oh,
meeting
which,
that was
you
happening.
want
I was
confidence.
I was online.
Sir,
And
we are going live. We are going live just now.
yeah, let's start.
Shubhendu sir, are you able to hear us? Shubhendu sir, can you see us? Can you hear us at all? I believe we are facing a technical glitch here. So.
Albina Fatima here. Yeah, Albina, I'd like to pick. Hello, everyone. Can we begin?
Yes, please.
Perfect. Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of iCLAS, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to our chair, our speakers, our rapporteurs, our tech team, all our attendees for this session, Utopias of Indian Modernities. We've had an intellectually stimulating morning and we're looking forward to an equally vitalizing afternoon. Our chair for today's session was Professor Mun, but he's having some audio problems this afternoon. So he is with us. He is a part of this session, but for convenience sake, Secretary of iCLAS, Professor Albina Shakil, who is professor at O.P. Jindal Law University, is going to chair the session. This is for convenience sake. So before I hand over to Albina to conduct the proceedings of this session, I'd like to just inform all our attendees that this is a session with 5 speakers. One of our speakers has dropped out. So we have Sachin Ketkar. In order of presentation, we have Sachin Ketkar, Asmat Jahan, Durjati Sarma, Kalyani Rajan, and Bharti Arora. Our rapporteurs are Ashutosh Agarwal and Chetna Rawat. They will take questions from the attendees from Facebook and from chat and mention the name of the questioner before presenting the question. On our tech team, we have Tanvi Sinha, Shahina Khanam, and Shrishti Singh. A warm welcome to all of you once again. And over to you, Albina, to conduct the session.
Thank you so much, Fatima ji, and hello, Professor Shubhendu Mund. If you can hear us, you are here with us. So, and welcome to all the participants. I wouldn't like to take any more time. Let us follow the same format as we have been following in each of the sessions. Our first speaker for the day is Professor Sachin C. Ketkar, He has been a chair of a very, very vibrant session earlier today, the first session of the conference on humanism, on transhumanism and post-humanism. And he's going to present a paper now. So over to you, Professor Sachin Ketkar.
Thanks a lot. Thanks the organizers of iCollects, especially Professor Asaduddin and Professor Kalyani, Professor Durjati. It's an honor and pleasure to share my views on this very timely and interesting topic. I will be very quickly sharing my screen, and given the limited amount of time that I have at my disposal, I will see what I can do. But I will first introduce the text and lay out the argument, at least in the 10 minutes that I have. So I would like to share my screen if that is permissible. It's not a slide, but it's my screen. I wonder if it is visible to you.
Yes, it's visible, Professor
Yeah.
Ketkar.
Right. I will be speaking on pre-colonial vernacular utopia and a model of early modernity, a study of Anandvan Bhuvan. The Marathi poem Anandvan Bhuvan, literally translated as the creation of forest of bliss. You can also call it palace of forest of bliss, or you can even think of it as the world of forest of bliss. In 59 shlokas, which is attributed to Swami Ramdas in 17th century, who is believed to have composed this poem after a dream at Kashi, which was called One Bhuvan in those days, of Ram Rajya-like order being reinstated on earth, probably due to coronation of King Shivaji, in which he sees the vision of strong Hindustan of the future, in which Vedic Brahmanism is revived after the defeat of sinners and lectures like Aurangzeb. It also indicates a spiritual space outside of eternal wandering, samsara, to be reached through Rama Bhakti and sadhana. So one of the questions that I ask myself, that the conventional thinking of modernity makes a distinction between the secular and the otherworldly spaces that you find in early modernity in the West. Maybe this relation between these two spaces was reconfigured in early modernity, and it's not seen as a dichotomy. And I think Swami Ramdas, as a philosopher, has tried to reconfigure this relation between the Paramartha and Prapancha, which is Sansar, and Pravrutti and Nivrutti, which are some of the key ideas. He seems to reconfigure it, and in the light of that, I would like to look at this poem, and I'm just going to be reading out some parts of it, not the entire one. Some scholars like S.K. Krishna calls this, Kulkarni calls it Swami's Bhavishya Purana. I seek to explore how far we can consider this as a utopia. And this is the poem. This is how it goes. Misery of birth, misery of old age, endless misery, again and again. One should leave this wandering from birth to birth and head for Anandvan Bhuvan. And it reminds us of very famous stotra ascribed to Adi Shankaracharya of Punarapi Jananam. But the space that you're left after you leave behind this samsara is Anandvan Bhuvan. So it's a space of Paramartha as well. When incessantly your consciousness is drawn towards Rama, you go beyond desire and detachment and reach Anandvan Bhuvan. What I once saw in my dream, I see it being realized before me, walking my own path. I reached Anandvan Bhuvan. The goddess has come as a deliverer to usher in an end of era by eliminating the demons and the mlechas in Anandvan Bhuvana. All the sinners are finished off and Hindustan is strong again. The enemies of the devotees have been wiped out in Anandvan Bhuvana. Finished off is Aurangzeb, the sinner. The mlechas have been routed. The broken down forts are restored again in Anandvan Bhuvana. Defeated are those who differentiate and discriminate. Finished off are reprobates and chandalas. God has destroyed, crushed and destroyed them in Anandvan Bhuvana. They have dropped off, fled, died or ruined. Earth is restored to her purity in Anandvan Bhuvana. Abundant waters are available for rites, rituals and bathing, and foundation of japas and austerity is laid in Anandvan Bhuvana. Health came back to the body, wealth started crossing the borders. Quintessence of all divinities is found in Anandvan Bhuvana. Ram is the one who does everything. Ram is the one who experiences everything. The kingdom of Ram is on earth. When I completely belong to him, how can I say he belongs to me? I wrote whatever I recalled from that dream. Hari walks and speaks with me. Let us see what happens next in Anandvan Bhuvana. So this is the text which is ascribed to Swami Ramdas. And I will look at it from the questions of modernity and early modernity. And scholars like Philip Wegner have indicated that the surge of interest in utopia in recent decades is because of recognition of deep relationship between the cultural form of utopia and experience of modernity. Sociologist Anthony Giddens has emphasized the critical role of reflexivity regarding social reordering in the process of modernization, and thus utopia/dystopia as a cultural genre can be understood as an important discursive form for articulation of modernity. While most of the accounts of modernity are Eurocentric, there is an increasing tendency among social and cultural historians like John Richards, Sheldon Pollock, and Sanjay Subramaniam to question Eurocentric narrative of modernity in South Asia by proposing the term early modernity to highlight continuities between the 18th and the 19th century. And interestingly, we are looking at 17th. The continuities like the global interconnectedness, the rise of large stable states, and increasing population and their parallels in the West. However, Dipesh Chakrabarty, whose own intellectual project emphasizes the importance of provincializing Europe in our historical research, ironically has expressed skepticism towards the term early modernity. And that's his essay called The Muddle of Modernity, from which I am using for my own title here. He points out that the notion of modernity must be clearly articulated in thinking about early modernity. And he insists upon making a distinction between the processes of modernization, the processes of building institution, and modernity, that is reflexive ideological discourses of political philosophy. And point out that most of the discussion of the early modernity in India have emphasized the former and have not sufficiently engaged with the latter, that is the reflexive ideological discourses of political philosophy. Nevertheless, reflexive discourses on statecraft and political philosophy did exist in Marathi in 17th and 18th century, like the treatise on statecraft titled Ajna Patra, somewhere in 1715. Apart from popularization of the term Rajkaran by the renowned Santa Swami Ramdas, and interestingly, this sampradaya which Ramdas founded had a profound impact on the polity later on. And the Ajna Patra, which is a letter written, which is a kind of chronicle or an account of Shivaji's empire, written at the behest of his great grandson, Sambhaji II, recounts the history of the empire, of his kingdom. And he also spells out the polity in terms of armada, in terms of navy, in terms of revenue, in terms of various offices, bureaucratic offices, and also propounds the theory of kingdom as something that is God's will, which expresses God's will on earth. And that's why this, and very interestingly, this text shows distinctive influence of Swami Ramdas's philosophy, as some of the scholars have shown. Now something about Swami Ramdas here. Along with Tukaram and Shivaji Raje Bhosle, one of the most influential figures of the 17th century is the prolific writer and founder of the Ramdasi sect. And he founded a sect devoted to Ram and Hanuman and traveled extensively across the subcontinent promoting Ram Bhakti. He lived a missionary life and built mutts and temples. As his sect paid great emphasis on practice of writing. Now, this is also very interesting given the fact that most of the understanding of Bhakti tradition seems to emphasize that it's an oral tradition and orality is primary. While this is definitely true, writing also as a practice flourished actually in pre-colonial times in Maharashtra, especially 17th century onwards, is something that we should be thinking about here. Primarily, it seems to be a fairly Brahminical sect, and Swami's teaching also seems to address his Brahmin disciples. And though it upholds Vedantic tradition, like the Varkaris, another very influential sect, it is less inclusive. And the figures of Ram and Hanuman and Ram Bhakti are central to this sect. Though Ram is an important divinity in Varkari tradition, he is never the central figure. Varkari as the tradition of Tukaram and Jnaneshwar and Eknath and so on. And interestingly, it lays great emphasis on physical strength, acquisition of physical strength, and through ideals of ultimate release through bhakti is Paramartha. There is also emphasis on material world, society and family called Prapancha, and it is, I'm skipping his biography very quickly and going on to, which is interesting, but given the lack of time, I think I'm just going ahead and looking at some of his important ideas very quickly. His main texts are Das Bodha, Manache Shlok, Atmaram, Karunashtaka, Garu Gita, and many stotras and artis, abhangas and barudas. Das Bodha is the key text here. And in the earliest version, which is called the Ekvis Samasi Das Bodh, there is a great emphasis on doing prapancha or living family life and material well-being, which has to be consolidated in order to strive for Paramartha, which is a new development in Marathi thought, because most of the bhakti looked at this family life as a space of suffering. To be detachment is something that you should strive for. But in Ramadas, you find a great emphasis on striking balance between Paramartha and Prapancha. And the term that he uses is Vivek, or ability to discriminate between right and wrong, and strike a balance between Prapancha and Paramartha. And this reconfiguration is, for me, an indication of early modernity, because materiality itself becomes not as important, but far more important than in earlier Marathi thought. There are letters that he has written to Shivaji and Sambhaji, which expresses his political vision, which I will very quickly read out. In his letter to Shivaji, which is one of the most famous paeans to the king, probably written in middle of 17th century, he says that Tirtha Kshetra modli Brahman sthane brasht zali, सकळ पृथ्वी आंदोळली धर्म गेला, या भूमंडलाच्या ठाई धर्म रक्षी ऐसा नाही, महाराष्ट्र धर्म राहिला काही तुम्हा करिता, उदंड राजकारणे तटले तेने चित्त विभागले, प्रसंग नसता लिहिले क्षमा केली पाहिजे. Which means the fords of pilgrimage are broken, faces of Brahmins corrupted, entire earth is shaken, and dharma has departed. There is no one except you to protect the dharma on this earth. Maharashtra dharma, and that is one of the key ideas in Marathi vernacular politics, is left because of you. 19th century onwards, we find Maharashtra dharma occupying central place in Marathi nationalist thought. But you find this term used prominently in Ramdas. And too much political conflict has divided our consciousness. And after several decades, he writes to letter to Sambhaji the young prince, he says, "Bahut लोक मेळवावे, एक विचार भरावे, करता करोनी घसरावे म्लेच्छांवरी. आहे तितके जतन करावे, पुढे आणिक मेळवावे, महाराष्ट्र राज्य करावे जिकडे तिकडे." Which means you have to form many alliances with many, inspire them for a single goal, and launch a formidable attack on the Mlecchas. One should preserve what you have, given the fact that Sambhaji was under great attack from Aurangzeb at that time when the letter was written. You have to obtain more as you go by in future and build Maharashtra Rajya. Now, the idea of Maharashtra Rajya and Maharashtra Dharma are extremely important in Marathi nationalist politics. So is the term Rajkaran, where he would say, मुख्य हरिकथा निरूपण, दूसरे ते राजकारण, तीसरे ते सावधपर्ण सर्व विषयी. That is, first come singing praises of Hari, second is Rajkaran, third is discretion in everything. So you can see the priorities here. What is happening in 17th century, that prapancha or Rajkaran, which is seen as ephemeral and full of suffering, is to be left behind, and you have to move towards the ultimate goal, that is moksha. But he is kind of creating, instead of a binary, a kind of order of priority, where mukhya is Harikatha Nirupan and dusre te Rajkaran, which is, for me, this reprioritization of thought in 17th century, for me, is in some sense indicative of early modernity. And the term Rajkaran is discussed at length by scholars like Prachi Deshpande. And I have asked myself whether such a program that Ramdas has in 17th century can be called ideological and political in modern sense at all. Because according to certain, I think, Marxist theory, idea of ideology and politics are bound with state and bourgeois formation. But the idea of ideology that is stated these days by Hoffman and Graham, that there is no pre-bourgeois ideology. So you can see that this Ram Bhakti and this reprioritization of material sphere and politics, instead of looking at it as a dichotomy, is seen as a kind of list of priority, is a kind of ideological attempt here. And you can see that there is a distinctive place of this ideology in the state formation, which is very unlike the state formation in the West, which was a bourgeois state. But here you can see it's almost a semi-divine or divine state. And it's a kingdom rather than a nation state that I think should be emphasized. So another term that is very important is Mleccha, and how is it associated with Ram Rajya? And the idea of Ram Rajya, please tell me if I'm running out of time so that I can shorten it further. Idea of Ram Rajya in Eknath, that is almost 16th century, seemed to have prepared ground for the vigorous Ram cult under the leadership of Samarth Ramdas in mid-17th century. Eknath's Bhavarth Ramayana became a major influence, and there is an emergence of major Ramayana narratives in 16th century onwards. And some of the most important Ramayanas are Mukteshwar, Sridhar, and Moropanth in 18th century, who is believed to have composed 108 Ramayanas, out of which 90 are available today, half of it. And Sheldon Pollock has argued at length that from early period, the Ram stories has supplied continuously and readily a repertoire of imaginary instruments for articulation of range of political discourses. And he points out how Ramayana imaginary became more centrally and dramatically inhabit public political space, as opposed to simply a literary space than it had ever before. That is what Pollock is arguing. And he also talks about how it allows, the Ramayana narrative allows the fully demonized other, and in the case would be Muslims, and how this has a longer history than the simple history from 19th century that we seek to formulate. And to an extent, you can agree with Pollock, but I have argued at length following Brajdural Chattopadhyay that to read Ramdas as anti-Muslim is simply extremely reductive, because he wrote extensively in Hindustani language as well. And there is something called Musalmani Ashtaka, in which he has a dialogue with Muslims where he addresses them as Bhai. And he says, Nahi wo Musalman Hindu kachchu hi, sarva jat mohi hahi bast yahi. शब्दों में कहे सो चलावे इलाही, जुदा ही नाही रे करबे लड़ाई, नहीं बाद बेबाद भाई तमन्ना, रहीम कहीं बाना सबों ने चलाना. God is neither Musalman nor Hindu. He lives in all caste. He lives in everyone. So why separate him and fight? This is also Ramdas. So to look at this period as simple Hindu versus Muslim kind of lenses is extremely reductive, which does not mean that there was no politics or no ideological moves made by 17th century individuals of the time. And I don't know how much time I have.
Professor Ketkar, you have just 1 more minute.
Fine.
The bell was very late.
Yeah. I will just wind up. There is a debate around the term of Maharashtra Dharma that we discussed, and it occupies central place in the 19th century nationalist cultural historiography of Mahadev Govind Ranade, who argues that Maharashtra Dharma, as you find it in Bhakti, is in an equivalent to Reformation kind of ideology, and he is countering Grant Duff, one of the earliest colonial historian of Maharashtra, who says that the Maratha polity, expansionism was largely predatory and turbulent spirit, and it did not have any ideological base for the expansion over the entire subcontinent, where Ranade says that the ideological component was the idea of Maharashtra Dharma. And modern historian tends to be dismissive that it articulates any such ideology. So this is where I want to stop by saying that this is definitely a kind of political vision of future, and it does address contemporary social politics of the period, and hence we can consider this in the light of what historians like C.A. Bailey has talked about as old patriotisms rather than new nationalisms, which have played a prominent and very powerful role in formation of nationalism. It is not simple borrowing of nationalism from the West, but these old patriotisms were recast, reconfigured in the later 19th century rhetoric. So in that sense, we can call this as old utopia, is what I am trying to argue here. So with this, I want to stop, and I want to really thank this conference organizer for giving me a chance to share something from my ongoing research. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Professor Ketkar. To all our audience who are tuned in and who are listening very, very carefully. This is a session on utopias of Indian modernities, and there couldn't have been a better beginning for this session because when Western utopia is talked about, it's also talked about in the period of Reformation, immediately vis-a-vis Thomas More, who was a very devout Catholic. And when King Henry VIII, the father of Elizabeth, was sort of separating from the Catholic Church, Roman Catholic Church, and he was trying to integrate religion and state into his own office, Thomas More wrote his famous book, The Utopia. But interestingly, the utopia was elsewhere, not here. And Professor Sachin Ketkar has, in his opening lecture, both questioned what modernity is, how it is to be conceived, what are the debates of modernity in India, especially about early modernity, what are the complications with reference to scholarly work and scholarly debates about early modernity. And he has then brought in Ramdas with his ideology, in a sense, of a state which, even though it is infused with religion, and I'm saying I see parallels there with Thomas More, because he was ultimately imprisoned and killed because he said no, for questions of religion when the new state was getting formed. Professor Ketkar, thank you for that paper. We'll get back to questions on your paper after everybody ends their presentation. Professor Ketkar's paper was Pre-Colonial Vernacular Utopia, the Muddle of Early Modernity, and the Study of Anand Van Bhuwan. Now we move to the next paper, which is by Asmat Jahan. I will request Asmat, as we have followed so far, to just quickly introduce herself and start with her paper, The Utopian Impulse of the Modern Urdu Poets. So I think I'm really looking forward to a very exciting debate on modernities and utopias here. Over to you, Asmat. Asmat Jahan, are you?
Yeah.
Yes.
I think, yeah.
No problem.
I mean, you had to unmute me, yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so I would begin by thanking the organizers, Professor Asaduddin, Professor Albina Shakil, and the entire iClass team for giving me a chance to participate in this conference. I feel greatly honored. And as a brief introduction, I am Asmat Jahan and I teach in Department of English, Jamia Millia Islamia. The title of my paper is The Utopian Impulse of the Modern Urdu Poets. The paper is an attempt to see the emergence of a utopian sensibility in Urdu poetry in the first half of the 20th century. Early 20th century marks a turning point in Indian history as a location of significant changes in the social sphere. The period is also remarkable for dissemination of new literary forms and new set of ideas. The new literary sensibility inspired a utopian impulse derived from the contemporary socio-political domain. This new utopian impulse expresses the imaginative ideal of a harmonious social order as an alternative to the existing socio-cultural disintegration. This is a literary impulse that articulates the ideal versus real. Marxism gave impetus to this kind of utopian impulse in Urdu poetry in the mid-20th century. Though most modern Urdu poetry endorses the spirit of liberal humanism, the poetry of the progressive group and their successors is particularly characterized by liberal and radical ideological leanings. The utopian or dystopian impulse in literature is characterized by social or political dreamings inspired by specific ideological inflections. The poetics of most modern Urdu poets, the progressives in particular, is inspired by the communist Marxist ideology. Their imagined utopia is a nuanced articulation for a replacement or an alternative power structure which has the possibility of a harmonious coexistence. The new poetic sensibility examines the actual state of being and draws attention towards the sharp contrast between the concrete reality and the imagined utopia by choosing the quotidian as the new subject for poetry. So this new poetry marks a shift from a romantic sensibility to a realistic sensibility, which is one of the defining characteristics of modern poetry. Modern poetry modern Urdu poetry with its progressive overtones and its liberal humanist orientation debunks the popular assumption about Urdu poetry that its appeal lies mainly in its romanticism and its flowery language. Modern Urdu poets make poetry an instrument of voicing the tensions and dichotomies of modern age, no longer centered on the discourse of spirituality and romantic love. Modern Urdu poetry engages with the harsh realities of contemporary life. So right in the beginning of the 20th century, we see that how certain common assumptions about Urdu poetry were being challenged by a new poetic sensibility, which became manifest in the Urdu poetry of the progressives in particular. Highlighting the centrality of love as the appropriate subject for poetry, Wali Dakkani once commented, "Shugal behtar hai ishqbazi ka, ko haqiqi ka ya majazi ka." Okay, so I'm quoting this couplet to show that how it was a specific kind of poetic discourse which was in fashion before the progressives, and progressives mark the beginning of a new poetic sensibility. The new subject matter of Urdu poetry marks a departure from the established conventions. The departure is the result of the exigencies encountered on account of rapidly changing socio-cultural dynamics. Though the revolutionary poetics of the progressives was spun by the poets of the classical school who dismissed their poetry as empty rhetoric of armchair socialists, the progressives continued singing the hymns of utopian social formation. Inspired with a great humanitarian zeal, these poets engaged with the emerging idea of nation and nationalism. The idea of nation has been at the center of post-colonial literary discourse. Defining the contours of national literature, Frantz Fanon remarks that national literature may be properly called a literature of combat, in the sense that it calls on the whole people to fight for their existence as a nation. It is a literature of combat because it molds the national consciousness, giving it form and contours and flinging open before it new and boundless horizons. It is a literature of combat because it assumes responsibility and because it is the will to liberty expressed in terms of time and space, unquote. So I've specifically quoted this remark by Fanon to highlight that progressive poets, they were also working on the same agenda, and for them literature became an instrument of social change. Okay, so these poets were not only poets, we can also call them activists or poet reformers. The trajectory of modern Urdu poetry shows that early modern poets gave a direction to the succeeding generation of poets who actively collaborated in the discourse of modernity in Urdu poetry. Hasrat Mohani is one of the early modern poets who expresses a note of rebellion against imperial oppression. He was sent to jail several times for his active involvement in the struggle for independence. And Hasrat Mohani is an early poet. And so there is, I'm trying to trace the beginning of, progressive thought, and it goes back much before the foundation of progressive writers movement. In his poetry, we find a rich amalgamation of tradition and modernity. In one of his poems, Hasrat Mohani expresses utopian desire for a time when the tyranny of imperialism will come to an end and the wealth of the nation will not remain locked in foreign coffers. A new turn was given to the discourse of modernity in Urdu poetry by Marxist socialism. Marxist socialism inspired an aesthetic centered on the idea of a future, overturning the nostalgically retrospective glance of romantic poetry into a prospective utopian vision. The present condition finds expression in a sustained melancholic gaze, but the disillusionment culminates into a hopeful note about the complete overthrow of all oppressive power structures. The future, not the past, becomes the focus or the focal point. The new poetic sensibility is modernist in its defiance and resorts to a dialectics of rebellion to bring succor to the suffering humanity. This is an emancipatory poetic vision inspired by a utopian impulse, characteristic of almost all the major modern poets in the early 20th century. These poets express, and there are about 20 poets, whom we can describe as progressive poets. 20 major poetic voices whom we can describe as progressive poets, and they were writing about the same time. These poets express extreme discontent with the growing evils of capitalism and dream of a world where harmonious coexistence will become a reality. This new poetry resonates with the idea of a modern revolution that would make the future strikingly different from the past as well as the present. Embarkment on a journey towards modern revolution is beset with challenges. I'm quoting Martin Pushner, after shedding the costumes and phrases of the past, the modern revolution somehow invite the future, come up with phrases, forms, and genres that derive their poetry from their future. The self-reflective gaze of the Communist Manifesto of Karl Marx is futuristic as it foregrounds the need to renounce the past and create a revolutionary ideal of the future. Denouncing the romantic lyricism of their predecessors, the Urdu progressive poets invented a new poetic idiom to articulate the ambiguities, tensions, and dualities of modern age. The new poet is neither a saintly figure sermonizing a discourse of renunciation nor a romantic dreamer lost in the labyrinth of lyricism and lovemaking. He is rather a realist or a revolutionary determined to change the world. Rejecting the art for art's sake philosophy, these poets effectively employed poetry as an instrument for social change. A considerable body of progressive poetry expresses growing disillusionment with the present, but is guided by a utopian impulse directed towards the future. Even in poems where one sees clear signs of the failure of the utopia imagined in the past, the poetic voice does not express, it does not always express a melancholic strain with respect to future. A common thematic strand that binds them together is their belief in humanitarianism. This is the shared agenda on which most of the progressives were working, so it expresses, there was a consensus, and all of them were committed to belief in humanitarianism. They dream of a world free from sectarianism, communalism, war, and violence, and celebrate the spirit of love and universal brotherhood. They imagine the world as a utopian land of mutual camaraderie, and this ideal of a harmonious living remains unrealized despite the attainment of freedom. So the poetic discourse after after freedom and after partition, we also notice a shift in poetic sensibility in the post-partition writing. All forms of literary writings are aesthetic responses to the prevailing socio-cultural conditions. Art for art's sake is a misnomer, as it is impossible to disengage art from the society. The manifesto of progressive writers movement is expression of the need for a radical change in literary standards and promotes the idea of literature as an instrument of social change. In this respect, progressive poetics is a radical response to the socio-cultural issues related to religion, gender, and sexuality. The progressive and radical poetic sensibility is very well articulated in the poetry of Faiz Ahmad Faiz. Faiz is widely acclaimed as a modern Urdu poet. His liberal progressive aesthetics is largely attributed to his exposure to Western education and culture. Both Faiz and Firaq express a new poetic sensibility which is characteristic of the modern age. The poetry of Faiz Ahmad Faiz marks the beginning of a new phase in Urdu poetry with a unique blend of tradition and modernity. Faiz argues in an essay on the idea of progressive literature, Adab ka Tarakki Pasand Nazariya, where he writes that our socio-cultural identity is determined by a set of values that we accept or reject. Our cultural identity is integral to our social identity. He acknowledges the overwhelming influence of political and economic forces in shaping the socio-cultural sensibility. Expanding the scope of progressive literature, Faiz says that all literature that encapsulates a liberal vision of society and culture qualifies to be described as progressive literature. So some of these ideas by Faiz are very well documented in the famous anthology Tarakki Pasand Tehreek by Khalilur Rahman Azmi. The first poetic anthology of Faiz, Naqsh Faryadi, was described by Noon Mim Rashid as an amalgamation of romance and realism. His progressive poetry is articulation of a utopian impulse for a society where harmonious coexistence is possible. It also expresses a romantic desire to reject the meaningless conventions and superstitions. The utopian impulse expands the horizon of his poetic imagination, and he takes Urdu ghazal to newer heights by shifting his poetic gaze on the sufferings of the poor and the downtrodden. So the subject of the ghazal changes, it undergoes a substantial change in the beginning of the 20th century. Before that, we find that the main subject of ghazal was love. And heterosexual love in particular. He exposes the evils of capitalism and expresses the need for establishing social justice and equality. Though disillusioned with the prevailing condition, he is not entirely hopeless. Instead of indulging in an empty rhetoric, he finds solution for social ills in the idea of a society founded on more secular and democratic principles. So despite the disturbing images of exploitation and suffering, his lyrics are hopeful and present a utopian ideal of an improved world order. In one of his couplets, he says, Dil na ummeed to nahi naakaam hi to hai, lambi hai shaam-e gham magar shaam hi to hai. One should not be deterred by persistent failure and lose hope. The evening, however long or painful, will surely come to an end. The evening is a metaphor for the darkness that is all pervasive, but it is seen as a passing phase, and the poet expresses a utopian impulse for a new morning. The revolutionary lyrics of Faiz Ahmad Faiz present a poetic voice which is determined to fight against all forms of tyranny and oppression. The speaker in the famous ghazal, The Tablet and the Pen, is an artist committed to the welfare of all, as he promises to be kind to the desolation of times. In a state of poetic frenzy, he cries for humanity. I'll go on nurturing the tablet and the pen. I'll go on recording what the heart goes through. Fez clearly defines the role of an artist as the harbinger of change. The artist is a revolutionary who has the moral courage to wear the garb of a torchbearer and ignite the spark of revolution. The following couplet from his popular Nazm on independence: this light is smeared and spotted, this night bitten dawn, this isn't surely the dawn we waited for so eagerly. Ye daag daag ujala, ye shab gazida seher. Okay, so I'm referring to this popular poem on which was written as a response to independence. It foregrounds the moment of freedom as a dark, bleak moment in Indian history. So Fez does not adopt a very celebratory kind of tone. There is a sense of lamentation because the poet experiences a sense of loss or betrayal. Fez, as a radical poet, uses similar set of images that Nehru uses in his famous Tryst with Destiny speech, but with his retrospective poetic glance, the familiar images are furnished with new meanings. Okay, so how much time is there? I can leave some of it.
Just 1 minute.
Oh, okay. Okay, so the main argument that I am trying to give in the paper, the paper examines that how Urdu poetry, it does not express a sustained, utopian sensibility, but there are fragments of utopian imagination that one can pick up in early modern poetry. Though the feeling of disillusionment or frustration was quite overwhelming, especially in the post-partition period. But still, you find a struggle to liberate oneself from that, kind of tragic engagement, and so there's a struggle to find hope in a utopian vision of the future. Okay, so I would like to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Jahan. Another very thought-provoking paper, because many people would say that there is a big debate about history and big contest in and about history. Do we progress? Is history just a decline? Are we just moving towards from good to bad to worse, which is there in a lot of religious ideas as well? But which would also be something that very, very acclaimed scholars like Foucault and others would conclude, that medieval times were better than modern times. But then there is the third way, which is that history is just a continuum. What is changing in life? Nothing. We love, we fall in love, we struggle for livelihood, we have power struggles, and we die. And some scholars at least have said that modernity itself is the future looking, forward looking view of history, that we will better something from the past, that we will create something better. At least the early modernity is sort of traced that way. And in that way, taking on from Professor Ketkar's paper, your paper was also providing a very different, but in some ways, a very connected point about, what is modernity and the modern turn in Urdu poetry. Taking a lot from the international Marxist trends of being inspired by revolution, and sort of coming into contest with the Romantic poetic tradition, which was more rule-bound and more classical in some ways. So thank you for that paper. We will take questions, and I would request people to be ready with their questions. We will now move to next paper presenter, that is Durjati Sharma. Durjati Sharma, it's my pleasure to call him because he's part of the organizing committee of this conference. So welcome, Durjati. He's going to present a paper on a failed utopian dream. So let's see what that is about. Over to you, Durjati.
Yeah, thank you, Alpina. Yes, it's an honor to be presenting a paper first in this conference, and also alongside some astute scholars who are also very good friends of mine. So I'm looking forward to your questions and your comments at the end. The title of my paper, straight away move into action. The title of my paper is A Failed Utopian Dream, Visions of a Commonwealth Desire in Ronju Hazarika's Eta Deep Hatta Kobor, which is an Assamese novel, and It's roughly, the title could be roughly translated as An Island and Seven Graves. Now, just before I begin discussing, just a word or two on the novelist. Ronju Hazarika is also he's also known as Kumud Chandra Hazarika. Ronju Hazarika happens to be his pen name, and he has been one of the most uh, famous author of popular literature in Assamese literature, and he has written over 750 books in Assamese, and the genres of his composition have ranged from science fiction, adventure, fantasy, and also utopian fiction. And and also he was associated with two most popular, sort of magazines in Assamese, Bismoy and Rahasya, which have always been very favorite amongst the young adults, and also with the has been very popular for the last 20 to 30 years. Now, this particular novel that I'm talking about, that I'll be discussing, was Eta Deep Hatta Kobor, was published in the year 1977, and so far it has gone through multiple reprints, and it was published, as the year would signify, it was published during a time of great political pessimism. If we talk about the late 1960s and throughout the 70s, we know the kind of political turbulence that India and also Assam, because he wrote this novel in 1977, and from 1979 to 1985, the Assam movement started. So his while writing this novel, obviously he could feel the pulse of the times. He could feel the fact that the Nehruvian dream, that and he was born in 1952, so obviously he was a teenager when these things were unraveling. So he could see how the dream was slowly going nowhere, right? As we have seen in many works of Indian literatures in the 1960s and 70s. So this particular novel, even though it doesn't deal directly with the Indian nation as such, but it talks about some of the important coordinates. It talks about, it discusses, and it makes its characters talk about some of the important factors that go into the making of a nation, or that go into the making of a commonwealth. A nation which is, it's something much more than that. So the novel, this narrative, that is, it's obviously an adventure narrative. It's about a ship, and which is wrecked in the storm, and there are, I'll come back. I'll come to the narrative, and then I'll start discussing. So this novel is set in the post-independence era, and Eta Deep Hatta Kobor, the novel begins with a prologue. It begins with a prologue, which incidentally is it's constitutive of the very set of lines that are placed at the end. Effectively, the paragraph that begins the novel also is placed at the end, right? So, while this may be seen as a novelistic technique of taking the readers at once into the heart of the narrative, it can simultaneously also hint towards a kind of circularity that brings the reader right to the beginning of the novel after he or she has gone through the whole narrative. Something I found very similar to what happens in 100 Years of Solitude. Like, as the narrative unfolds, so somehow we are again brought back to the beginning of the narrative. So I'd like just to dwell very briefly with the prologue. And the prologue is, I'll quickly read in Assamese, and then I'll provide the translation. It reads something like that. I mean, since this is a panel on Indian modernity, so I feel we should also read out how it sounds in the original. So it says, "Hey diptu etiao ase, aru ase hey kobor hatuta. কেতিয়াবা কোনোবা তালৈ গলে সেই কবৰ সাতটা হয়তো নেদেখিব, সেয়া লাভাৰ তলত পুত গল। কিন্তু ৱাৰ্ণ, চৌ, ডক্টৰ ট্ৰেইন, কেম্বেল, জক, আমিছ আৰু ফ্ৰানিক সাগৰৰ পাৰত নিশ্চয় লগ পাব। এতিয়াও তেওঁলোকে সাগৰৰ পাৰে পাৰে কেঁকুৰা বিচাৰে, হেলিকপ্টাৰ দেখিলে হুমুনি আহকাৰে, কিন্তু দ্বীপটোৰ পৰা অহাৰ কথা সমূলি চিন্তা নকৰে। I've translated it. It says that island is still in existence, and so are those 7 graves. if someone someday goes there, will possibly not see those 7 graves. Those graves may have been buried deep beneath the lava. However, they are sure to meet Warren, Cho, Dr. Train, Campbell, Jock, Amis, and Franny by the seaside. They still hunt for crabs along the seashore. They shy whenever they see a helicopter pass by, fly by, but they never ever think of leaving the island. So these 7 persons, I spoke about 7 graves. So there are 7 characters plus one more. I'll come to that. Now the 7 characters, they belong to 7 different countries. There's one called Frederick Warren. He's from England. Cho Chen Ling, he's from Hong Kong. Dr. Russell Tren, he's from Uganda. Armis from France. Joseph Frani, his nationality is not revealed. Hermann Jock from Germany, and Campbell from Canada. Now, all 7 of them were on board a ship, which is called as Atlanta, which got wrecked during a violent storm, only leaving behind these 7 survivors, these adult survivors on this island, and interestingly, a child called Deva Singha, and he's an Indian prince. He was traveling with his parents in the ship, and none of them survived, and the little boy was stranded along with these 7 adults. This is a story of 7 adults and a child. Now what happens now when they meet? Obviously the storm happens throughout the night, and like in the morning when they meet each other, the first thought that crosses their mind, all of them prepare, brace themselves to survive on the island till help or rescue arrives. Warren, now interestingly, Warren, the English gentleman, is the first one to voice out his apprehensions regarding the possibility of ever returning home. He refers to this island as a death island, Mrittu Deep. He refers to this island as a death island. Nobody will ever come for any help. This is what he states. He specifically marks the date of their arrival on the island, which is the 13th of November. And as it happens, later in the narrative, as we shall see, Warren is the first person to die. He's the first one to meet his end, being strangled to death by an octopus. Now, interestingly, amongst the other fellows, there are 2 others who knew each other from behind. Obviously, we all assume that they are all strangers. They were on board a ship and they were all stranded. But then all of them meet as strangers except 2 who knew each other from before. Now, there's one person called Hermann Jack. He was a German and he's a detective, a secret agent, and he's in hot pursuit of a serial killer who happens to be none other than Franny, the other person. He's also so the criminal whom he's pursuing. He also survives the shipwreck, and they meet upon that island. Now Campbell, now obviously, who happens to be none other than Franny. Now when Franny reminds Jack that we are like the 2 enemies who have confronted each other, Campbell says something. I'll just read the translation because of the paucity of time. This is what Campbell says, and this is how the novel, actually Campbell, the Canadian character, happens to be the mouthpiece of the novelist. I mean, I think he's the favorite of the novelist, and he's the one through whose words the novelist would be seen as voicing his concerns. Now here, what is Campbell talking about? What I would rather say, refer to as a Commonwealth vision. He says, and this is how what I'm going to analyze. Campbell says, and I've translated, that at present, however, we are travelers on the same path. Neither Jock is a secret agent here, nor Franny any criminal of international disrepute. The world into which we have stepped into right now, here in this world, there is no religion and there is no politics. Here in this world, you 2 are just 2 ordinary human beings. And for all of us here, we have just one objective, that is to survive. We have no individual identities here. So this is, this is where, the critique actually begins. And here what Campbell is doing is to envision a new world order, that very remarkably strips the idea of individuality of all the vestiges of self-fashioning. Besides, by downplaying the very sacrality and sanctity of the repressive state mechanisms, which makes one human being a legal custodian or a guardian. Here, Jock is a secret agent of the state, and another a criminal or a violator of that law. Prani is a criminal of international renown or disrepute, whatever we call. But Campbell brings to the fore an interrogation of the very factors that marks the idea of progress and civilization. We're coming to that very quickly. Now, in an interesting turn of events, questions are also raised over the efficacy or even the necessity of English as an international language. Now, apparently, what happens is that now all of them have to converse with one another. They all belong to 7 different nationalities. Now, here, the question that the novelist is trying to sort of put forward is that what roles can or does English play in the imagination of a Commonwealth? I think from an Indian perspective, this is something that we can also look into, that the role of English as an international language. So, because Dr. Train, who was a Ugandan geologist, he very succinctly claims that we do not need the agency of language to survive. Language is only the creation of mankind. Everyone would understand the language ordained by God. We need to know only the language to survive. So the question here was basically, actually why this question of language cropped up was because of this boy prince who cannot speak any other language apart from Hindi. Now these other characters, they do not know Hindi. So the question was, if that boy can survive without a language, right? But can we survive without sort of resorting to English or any language that we refer to as lingua franca, right? So here, Frederick Warne, who was an Englishman, he actually, he had actually, sort of prompted this whole thing when he spoke on the efficacy of English as the most effective lingua franca over and above the mother tongues of all other. He's the one who provoked this whole discussion. This leads to a very long, protracted argument with everyone contesting Warren's claim regarding English. So the novelist here is also attempting to deconstruct the very presumptions of superiority based on language. But however, the novel takes a very quick turn because apparently Warren distances himself from his companions and he goes in search of food, and obviously he gets strangled into in the tentacles of an octopus, and he's killed. And very soon, all his companions die one after another. Some of them die by food poisoning. Some of them sort of dies by, one of them dies by consuming a fruit. One of them commits suicide. But I'll end with this. I'll quickly end in a minute. So this last thing happens was the last conversation that happens between Jock and Prani. Apparently, those two are the ones who are left at the end. Now, what happens? Jock refuses to leave the island. He says that if I go back to the world, I will become the detective. He will become the criminal. I do not want to destroy this friendship that we developed here over the period of our stay. But then apparently, like what happens, Jock also meets his end. Exactly what happens in the end was that Prani is the last one to survive. And at very point of time, an helicopter arrives looking for that boy prince. Right. And what Prani had said that the Jock was the penultimate person to die. What Prani says that quickly I will go, I will bury him and I'll come. Right. And the other people in the helicopter, they're waiting. But what happens in the meanwhile, it's a volcanic island. Suddenly the volcano erupts. And by the time Prani could return to the helicopter, suddenly the whole island is covered with lava. And what happens? Prani is not, he doesn't die, but he is buried alive in his own grave by the lava. So this is how the novel ends. So all of these characters in their own specific ways had visions of a commonwealth. One was an optimist, one was a rationalist, one was a pessimist, right? One of them was a mediator. So we see how the whole idea of a commonwealth, of its different, mentalities, kind of mental specificities we see, and at the end, nothing is left except 7 graves. So here, and the novelist very adroitly he raises question on the idea of religion. So there was a question whether Devasingha, the boy prince, whether he should, dig a grave for himself or will he be cremated? Right. So these are the questions that the novelist tries to raise. So maybe if we have questions, I can sort of discuss them further. But for the moment, I would like to conclude my presentation. Thank you all for patiently listening to my presentation, listening to my paper. Thank you all. Thank you so much. Over to Albina. Please unmute yourself, Albina.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Durjati Sharma. Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Okay, okay.
Thank you.
So thank you for that paper, for that very thought-provoking paper. And in your title itself is your analysis that it's a failed utopian dream. And the failed utopian dream has double meanings because at one level you are locating it as a failed utopian dream of India's independence. Which is soon going to give way to, or is already started sort of unraveling, unfolding into many political developments around the country. He's writing at a time when there is the emergency happening as well. So many things have many reasons for disillusionment. And of course, you very presciently said that the Assam movement was just about to start. So there is a glimpse, there is a sense there of one utopian dream having failed, or at least the sense sinking in. And there is the double meaning there because there is an attempt the moment one goes into new islands, especially 7 adults with young small prince, a young child to take care of. There is always the possibility of making a new start. And that the fact that the new start ends up in apocalypse, despite its multinational and a very diverse ideological sort of gathering, even within those 7 people. So very thought-provoking, but we'll get back to you in terms of the questions. I'm sure people have questions. I have a lot of questions about the child, but we'll discuss that later. Now I have the pleasure of inviting another of my co-organizers and co-office bearers of ICLALS, that is Kalyani Rajan. She's the treasurer of ICLALS. She teaches at Shahid Bhagat Singh Evening College. So over to you, Kalyani, for your paper.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Albina. I'll directly plunge into my paper. It's a work in progress, so my sincere apologies. The title of my paper is Interrogating Mind, Market and Madness in the Dystopic World of Gyan Chaturvedi's Pagal Khana, 2018. Padma Shri Dr. Gyan Chaturvedi, a noted cardiologist by training and a veteran Hindi satirist by profession, seeks to explore the ravages of a world ruled by market culture in his 5th novel, Pagal Khana, 2018. The novel employs the genre of satirical fantasy and an experimental narrative structure replete with interweaving stories, unnamed character types and fragments constructed with an economy of words, images, and themes. His previous novels, Narak Yatra, based on the Indian medical system and teaching training thereof, Baramasi, Marichika, and Hamna Marab, have amply established and bolstered his niche in the annals of Hindi literature, beside famous satirists such as Harishankar Parsai, Sharad Joshi, Srilal Shukla, and the like. The novel Pagal Khana, hardly an easy breeze, comes alive to a sensitive reader in more ways than one, but most significantly as a cautionary tale holding a window to the dystopic future, completely overrun, owned, and dictated by the market forces, where time, personal freedom, dreams, memory, and all rational thought per se are systematically sucked out and annihilated, laid down to furthering the nefarious interests of the market. Speaking generally, one of the most visible hallmarks of globalization is the market. And the market has come to impact all facets of human life in a more intimate way than ever before. For any working professional today, it is nearly impossible to imagine a world without the numerous conveniences or hazards of technology, and in turn, the market, which produces and regulates/governs it. From the remarkable accessibility of the mobile phones, which seem to replace everything from snail mail, the television, the air conditioner, remote control, and home security, to the quote unquote necessities of instant messaging, social media, and its elaborate facade of constantly being, within quotes, in touch with everyone, to the luxuries of buying both real estate properties and daily groceries with a single click, to investments and trading with each and every pulse of the sensex, to online consultations with doctors, astrologers, fitness experts, online classrooms and bank transactions, to booking hotels and travels by cycle, bus, auto, car, air, train, to buying used, refurbished household items and other such on sites like OLX and eBay, to finding love, sex, companionship, and spouses through simply swiping profiles, to tailor-made new age arts, literature, music, theater, cinema, to one-stop identities defined by numbers, phone number, Aadhaar, PAN, and so on. Utility and speed define the primary work culture today. Rapidly evolving technologies, including those powered by artificial intelligence, are being used in life-saving capacities, as also in personalized advertising, serving customers better by subtly reprogramming their behavior, analyzing and classifying an ever-increasing horde of data, and more data, toppling and enlivening lives, careers, governments, declaring and winning wars, promoting and ensuring peace, covert, overt, blanket surveillance for security purposes, encouraging, modifying, or suppressing dissent and or rebellion, recording, labeling, and classifying on the basis of sex, caste, religion, class, language, state, nation, race, and so on in various binding ways for better or for worse. These are merely a few more truths of the post-truth world that we are inhabiting in these times. So for better or for worse, these times can either be signs of the golden era, a panacea for all problems hindering the progress of the human race since times immemorial, or in the epitome of a refashioned Coetsian horror from Joseph Conrad's The Heart of Darkness, which seeks to subsume life as we have known it, of all things innocent, beautiful, and delicate, relinquishing all logic, rationality, and above all control at the feet of the market forces, which are driven by data, numbers, graphs, and cold stoic analysis. It is the latter that Chaturvedi expertly portrays in Pagal Khana, where the lines between sanity and insanity seem to be blurred beyond easy recognition, where all long accepted standards perform tango with the whims of the market, and where all routes of escape are possibly more closely watched than a maximum security prison. Bazarwad, the term Chaturvedi uses effortlessly throughout the novel, has no simple equivalence in English. It can be best understood as a market culture driven by ruthless capitalist and corporate interests, number-driven economic indices, consumerism of the worst order, and the vagaries of evolving globalized tendencies. The novel is prefaced with a long and detailed introduction where Chaturvedi candidly offers several crucial insights into his own craft, the actual process of writing the novel, and the theme being explored. He claims to be following the tradition of Shrilal Shukla in investigating why a writer continues to write despite, and I quote, stressful, difficult, and somewhat long period of isolation that the writer experiences in the process of writing. Chaturvedi reaches a probable answer that when a writer passes through the hell of a long, difficult period and in the end completes the novel, perhaps he finds such a heaven that fills him with a sense of unique contentment for a long time, and in turn prompts him to undertake the tasks repeatedly thereafter. Chaturvedi explains that as a result of self-imposed solitary confinement, this writer is actually able to get under the skin of his characters, parkaya pravesh, which is akin to the state of penance. Such a writer becomes one with his characters and their world and enters their soul, quote, producing, breaking, creating, decorating, and enhancing things therein in a state of solitude. So he talks about his own process of how he went about writing this novel. And Chaturvedi reveals that he worked on 6 drafts in all for Pagal Khana in a span of 2 years, where he completely shut himself off from the rest of the world and was inhabiting this extremely chaotic space that Pagal Khana's dystopic world actually inhabits. In Seeds of Time, the political theorist Frederick Jameson has talked about dystopian novels as illustrating a critique of high modernism as repressive, totalizing, phallocentric, authoritarian, and redolent of sublime and inhuman hubris. So what we are left with here as the end product in the form of a fictional universe of Pagal Khana is a gloomy dystopic world, which is at the same time horrific and obsessively alluring. In this novel, Chaturvedi has managed to face the dual challenge head on. In his own words, he says, the first was to ensure one realistic end of the fantasy was always in the reader's hand. And secondly, keeping his own complete control over the narration of the fantasy, lest it become too hasty or zigzag for the reader to lose curiosity or comprehension. This novel is actually divided into 5 broad chapters comprising of several fragments. The poetic epigraph actually progresses from describing the complete control of the market or the bazaar over life to explaining how a few unhinged people continue to believe that life was greater than the bazaar, that the values of life were greater. Small quotation, translation mine. They were called mad. This is the tale of those madmen. This is the tale of those mad times. This is the tale of your own time. This last line actually jolts the reader into questioning his own times and his own location, both mentally, sane versus insane, and physically. So the first chapter begins by describing the paradoxical nature of the bright darkness spread by the bazaar, where the world was able to see the glare of the new light of the bazaar, and but in fact was not able to see anything at all. I will read a very short excerpt here. दुनिया बाजारवाद के कब्जे में आ गई थी, दुनिया बाजार में रहना और जीना सीख रही थी, पर कुछ लोगों ने बाजारवाद को पागलपन माना और बाजार को पागल खाना, एक चमकीले अंधेरे से भरा हुआ पागल खाना। इन लोगों ने इस अंधेरे से भागने की कोशिशें शुरू की। क्या ये लोग पागल थे? पर दुनिया जब एक विराट पागल खाने में बदल रही हो, तब भला कौन तय कर सकता है कि असल में पागल कौन है? वे जो लोग बाजार से भाग रहे थे या वे जो बाजार का हिस्सा हो गए थे? बड़ा पागल समय था ये, इसी कठिन समय की ये कहानी है. This bleak picture of complete market control painted by the subsequent fragments plunges the reader into the heart of the novel. An upscale clinic of a psychiatrist who is clearly an agent of the bazaar, complete with luxurious furnishings, a beautiful receptionist, and showroom-like ambience. The patients are mostly old men at the psychologist's place, brought in by their wives and sons, and are routinely scolded to keep their madness in check. In the next fragment, the description of a people treating the grave natural calamity like flood with frivolity, encouraging water sports in flood, and adjusting themselves with the flood by living on rooftops, creating jokes, which are shared virally on Facebook and WhatsApp, adds to the bizarre and horrific takeover by the bazaar in the manner of a silent coup. The next couple of fragments of the chapter build up the complete picture, showing a walkover given by both God and the government to the machinations of the bazaar. A paranoid old man actually fears that his son will soon sell him on OLX, while the middle-aged woman listening to this sordid proposition concurs by lauding the uniqueness of the idea, suggesting that perhaps the bazaar has launched an attractive scheme to buy old parents. The second chapter identifies several interweaving stories of madmen trying to escape the bazaar due to different grievances. So there is one person who is seeking freedom from the bazaar, and he tries to dig a tunnel through a massive garbage dump right behind the glittery bazaar. There is another who is distraught that the bazaar has stolen all his dreams and he is unable to dream at all during the sleep at night. Consequently, he remains hysterical throughout. There is a third madman who is poor, unemployed, in search of a new world, and he decides to explore the world inside filthy sewage pipes under a manhole. The fourth is a wealthy man, fearing for the safety of his corpus and his family, and his vigilance is bordering on obsession, deciding to dig a tunnel to hide his precious possessions from the all-pervasive prying eyes of the bazaar. Another middle-aged man is driven to exasperated madness because he has lost all his memories, replaced effectively by in the beginning by the ups and downs of the bazaar in its dealings, to a complete dementia and Alzheimer's disease. So this entire novel has very imaginative chapter titles like God was with the bazaar because he was not mad, a dream inside a dream and blood on the palms. Bazaar was watching everyone, especially the madmen. So Chaturvedi's knowledge of the medical profession is also amply indicated. So there are conversations with ophthalmologists, psychiatrists. There are people whose lines from the hands are wiped off. You know, there are all kinds of scenarios which are completely normalized, and everybody is accepting it because this is the bazaar and this is the current way of life. I'm skipping a few portions and I'm down to 12 minutes. So the novel defies, okay, I can read this. Chaturvedi's portrayal of the bazaar as a cold, calculated individual who will stop at nothing to cash in on any opportunity to expand business is both hilarious and scary. Treating potential customers with extremely fake concerns and reverence, robbing them of their power to think or choose by giving them a false sense of warmth and care. In the novel, the conversations of the bazaar with the customers are several and perfectly crafted in the tone of a regular customer care operative who apologizes, distracts, reveres, and persuades, all in the same vein. The fourth chapter takes the stories to their culmination, while the man living in the manhole becomes a newsroom and social media sensation. The man who had lost his dreams loses his mind, wearing shoes on his head and walking barefoot in the bazaar, collecting pieces of his broken, bleeding dreams. The wealthy, paranoid man manages to hide his gold and money in a dirty tunnel, but eventually dies when forced out by his son to retrieve them. And then the man looking for freedom from the bazaar is eventually deified into Tunnel Baba, Surang Baba, with a growing cult following, secretly happy to see the rising number of madmen brought to seek his blessings. And this is the last paragraph. The novel defies a simple reading by the complexity of both its narrative structure and its theme. The unnamed characters come from varying backgrounds, and their fears come alive to the reader with a great deal of eeriness at different junctures. The entire novel is built on this dystopic vision of the bazaar ruling the mankind. In the dystopic fantasy world of Pagal Khana, bazaar becomes all powerful, ruling even over even natural elements like sunshine, then making decisions on behalf of everybody, deciding trends like cutting off one's nose, taking off head off the shoulders, identical faces of people and absent lines of fate from the people's palms, stench and perfume becoming synonymous, and so on. Chaturvedi's biting satire and razor-sharp wit is on the mark throughout the novel, keeping the reader both engrossed with an almost perverse curiosity to find out how deep is the fall and a sense of horrified reality check, whether they have already crossed the threshold in their own real times. Placing a well-deserved faith in his readers, Chaturvedi renders the final rebellion and silver lining in the climax to be wrenched by time in the final chapter in an enormous and classic coup d'etat. And I'll just finish by reading out these lines, which says, हुजूर समय ने विद्रोह कर दिया है. किसने? समय ने. कभी समय भी उसके विरुद्ध विद्रोह कर सकता है, बाजार ने सोचा ही नहीं था. अपनी स्कीम में उसने इस बात का कभी इंतजाम ही नहीं किया था. बाजार तो अब हमेशा स्वयं को समय से परे समझता था. वह कितना गलत था. समय ने विद्रोह कर दिया था. विद्रोह का समय था वह. बाजार कदाचित यह बात अब भी ना समझ पा रहा हो, पर एक न एक दिन ये तो होना ही था. Thank you so much for listening to me.
Thank you, Kalyani. We have had another very, very interesting and thought-provoking paper. There is a big debate, at least as far as gender studies is concerned, that when more crimes against women get reported today, is it a sign that the incidents per se are rising, or is it the sign that people are becoming more conscious and therefore more sort of reporting is increasing? And similarly, regarding the question of mental health, there are some subtle debates about that when we are addressing questions of mental health in our contemporary world. Is it because the awareness about mental health is improving and therefore more people are seeking redressal? Or is something causing mental health issues? So this very, very interesting sort of juxtaposition of the market with madness, with the question of mental health itself, and with no escape but in madness or but through madness, and the normalization of the market. So a very, very interesting idea about dystopia, because dystopia has got to do with a loss of hope of kinds. Many people say that all utopias contain within them, and we had a keynote speaker also saying that all utopias contain them a dystopia, because after all, they are a criticism of something, and the present, to be able to imagine a future which is beautiful. But all dystopias contain within them some rebel figures. And it's through those rebel figures, really, that dystopias carry some light at the end of the tunnel. So we'll get back to Kalyani Rajan's paper and discussions over it. Now we have the last paper of the day with Dr. Bharti Arora. I invite Dr. Bharti Arora to briefly introduce herself, and over to you.
Good evening, everyone. I'm audible.
Could you be a bit louder?
Okay.
Yes.
So, yeah, thank you. I work at the Department of English in Tagore Government Arts and Science College, that is affiliated to the Pondicherry University. So I'll start my paper now. I will be speaking on Alka Sarabi's novel Janki Das Tejpal Mansion. The title is Utopian Quest of Nehruvian Developmentalism Gone Awry. The immediate post-independence period, as we all know, was dominated by Nehruvian socialism, whose credos were poverty alleviation and development. They comprised the foundational standards against which the policy proposals and political claims of the period were measured. However, the Nehruvian state betrayed its myopic perspectives by according an utmost divine or quasi-mythic status to technology and progress as sole arbiters of its decolonized utopia. In the words of Sudipta Kaviraj, the state was conceived in really revolutionary terms. Its task was precisely to drag into a modern age a largely reluctant conservative society, directly attacking its unjust and reactionary practices. Thus, the state became an enchanted institution which could pull ordinary people out of their dystopian despair experienced under the colonial rule, putting them on the path to progress. However, the spirit of this utopia often ran contrary to the pressures of state-sponsored capitalist development. Even as the state initiated land reform and redistributive measures to alleviate poverty, it equally pandered to the interests of elite and propertied classes. This exclusive outlook was evident from 1939 onwards, when the Congress High Command convened the National Planning Committee under the leadership of Nehru to propose and engage with the contours of the future development policy. And this was a radical document in a way, because it advocated the reduction of the working week to 48 hours, fixing minimum age for factory labor at 15, implementing health security, safety regulations, and minimum wage for all workers. However, the domination of the the emergent state's industrial developmentalist agenda within the Congress, sort of deferred the implementation of these measures to a great extent. In light of this, reading Alka Saravgi's Janki Das Tejpal Mansion, my paper proposes how the utopian quest of Nehruvian developmentalism went awry after independence. Saravgi experiments with the formal elements as she strategically accommodates the protagonist Jai Govind's trysts with autobiographical writing within the novel. His quest to recreate his past makes Jai Govind weave a pattern of incidents which not simply verge on the worldly questions of history and politics, but recast his yearnings for success and validation in life. He names the protagonist of his autobiographical novel as Jaideep, comprising both his name as well as his wife's Deepa's name in it. Even as the recreated incidents of the past aim to reconfigure the nature of the world as inhabited by Jai Govind, they do not propose or make claims upon an ethical and political understanding of the world. Except the slight moderation in the name, there is nothing that undergoes any radical alteration in it. The novel within the novel format reads almost like a seamless narrative of missed opportunities in life. Janki Das Tejpal Mansion illustrates through Jai Govind's failed trysts with destiny, how the ideal of development and technological progress in post-independence India was exclusive, myopic, and centralized in multiple ways. The construction of the first underground metro in the 1970s Calcutta arrived as an insignia of this progress and development. While the inhabitants of Bada Bazar are excited at the prospect of participating in the project of speed and development, they soon realize that this participation entails sacrifices, suffering and displacement from their homes. For Advocate Babu, who is Jai Govind's father in the novel, the metro train is no less than an agent of destruction. He said that he could clearly hear the sobbing of Central Avenue flats. He further declares that the digging of metro tunnel would ruin the foundations of all houses in and around the Bada Bazar area. He expresses his reservations about the unscrupulous development and progress that would displace people, leading to immense environmental damage. Thus, Saravgi problematizes the aura of modernizing technologies and economic progress as per which displacement becomes a form of development and environmental damage a necessary evil. And many theorists and economists like Anjan Chakravarti have worked on this. Jai Govind is unable to come to terms with this warped notion of public good, which seems intent on throwing him out of his ancestral home in the mansion. Despite the fact that mansion is declared a dangerous zone to inhabit by the metro authorities and the court, he refuses to leave it. In fact, he assumes the leadership of Metro Pirit Bandhu Association to represent the rest of the 80 families inhabiting the mansion, waging a struggle on their behalf against the metro authorities. Interestingly, the novel does not build any moral distinction of sorts between the developmental excesses of the state on the one hand and its victims on the other. It betrays how citizens' negotiation of the state is complicated by a complex network of bureaucracy, politics, money, power, and middlemen. This reveals, to quote Akhil Gupta, the disaggregated view of the state, exposing contradictions across levels and bureaus in the management and control of populations, offering a renewed understandings of both the institutions of the state as well as disparate motivations of citizens who negotiate or oppose these structures. In the novel, Jai Govind is not merely a victim of displacement, but a significant cog of an underground bureaucratic network of the state that is complicit with money and muscle power, forging the most profitable bargains in return. So, for instance, his efforts to stall the demolition of an eviction from the mansion are not driven by his love of ancestral property, but they are aggravated by an enchantment of power and influence. Even as he is fully aware of the dangerous implications of inhabiting this dilapidated building, he strikes the most profitable deal with the mansion's owners as well as makes the metro officials renovate the mansion, and particularly his house that is especially decorated with the mosaic tiles. So neither of these actions is driven by an ethical urge to settle the matter in favor of the affected inhabitants of the building. The novel indirectly highlights the variegated patterns of leadership assumed by people within a social movement, which may or may not be driven by a radical intent to transforming society. And this is the comment on the Times, because 1970s witnessed this grand flourishing of the social movements across the country. Jaideep, or Jai Govind, excels the art of heckling the corridors of power, court, judiciary, police, corporation office, metro office over time. His assertion that nothing comes for free hints at how the redistributive and welfarist assumptions of the nation state have no relevance in the contemporary world order driven by market forces. The only way in which he could negotiate this neo-capitalist nation state is by bargaining his identity as a citizen. This is not very dissimilar to how Jai Govind negotiates his American sojourn as an Indian from the third world, the so-called third world. Instead of contesting the myriad and subtle hegemonies that surround him in the guise of American civilization, he chooses to either escape from them or make compromises. He has this desperate desire to belong to that white country, as he himself says that. So, he invests in a Ford car that becomes his gateway to enter the hallowed world of America. He attempts to bargain his identity as an Indian for forging a consumerist identity as a rich Indian living in America. As Tom Moylan argues, utopia has been drained of its future-bearing energy and repacked as a signifier of what has already been achieved, so much so that the very act of consuming in the present world order is always already utopian. Very interestingly, this description to belong to America is an offshoot of his upper caste majoritarian outlook. Saraogi connects this outlook seamlessly with Jai Govind's resistance to using and cleaning his WC in America. This further betrays how this so-called resistance reveals Jai Govind's disgust for redistributive obligations of the state. And here I would like to quote from the original, because it's a very complex kind of response. उन लोगों की नजरों में सभ्य होना जयदीप के लिए मजबूरी की हद तक एक जरूरत थी। किसी तरह कमोड को छूने पर अपवित्र हो जाने की भावना से जयदीप ने अपने को मुक्त किया था, पर हर बार भारत से लौटने के बाद उसे नए सिरे से फिर इसे सीखना पड़ता। वह कमोड की सीट को पोछे बिना उस पर आज तक नहीं बैठा था। कमोड पोछते वक्त उसे लाल गमछा बांधे हुए पिता और एड़ी तक साड़ी पहनी हुई माँ की याद आ जाती थी। So, this may seem to be a very trivial kind of an incident, but and humorous also, but it reveals his deep disgust for the redistributive justice and egalitarian measures of the Indian nation state. His, the fact that he has always made fun of the state's measures for giving things for free. And, he always says there is nothing that comes for free. Ironically, he does not realize that his much coveted visit to America in the 1960s was facilitated by this things given for free, the philanthropic access practiced by America to woo India to the capitalist bloc during the Cold War era. So his friend tells him, America granted these scholarships so that it could mobilize intellectual opinion in its favor and create a market for its own agricultural seeds and fertilizers in return. Alternatively, Jai Govind would like to believe that his father's hard-earned money facilitated his visit to America. His efforts to complete his education there, despite the then ongoing anti-Vietnam protests, student movements across campuses, and other so-called distractions, comprise his personal narrative of accomplishment. Jai Govind finds it difficult to believe that all his education, individual commitment, compromises struck abroad could have been a part of a larger neo-imperial destiny. Saraogi underscores through this incident that there are no personal utopias which could emerge out of our complacency with the consumerist capitalist world. Alternatively, one has to become an agent of actual radical change in order to forge both personal and collective utopias. Jai Govind fails to become this agent of change, and his life unfolds in a series of missed opportunities. Even as he works extremely hard to give his best to his maiden job in the Birla's office, once he gets back to Calcutta, he is unable to retain that job for himself. His American sojourn also could not train him to sustain the fierce competition, jealousy, one-upmanship of the company. Satish Deshpande informs that a noteworthy feature of the Nehruvian socialism is a strong link that is constantly being established between patriotism and work. The theme of work is continually emphasized, especially its difficulties, its scale, its limitlessness. The nation is not only the locus for all work, but it is also the end towards which this work is moving. Patriotism is quite literally the act of building a nation. Raised upon these ideals and aspirations of the Nehruvian regime, as per which Jagdeep and his generation was taught to build the nation with their own youthful resources, he feels betrayed by the new regime intent on consolidating the powers of political, and this regime is Indira Gandhi's regime. Even as he tries his best to remain unaffected and away from the protests and social movements of his times, repeating what he has already done in America, he cannot stop himself from nurturing a general discontent in his heart against the system. Jaideep's failed tryst with the work culture of Hind Motor Works, which is the Birla's company, echoes the country's failed tryst with socialist planning and developmentalism. The only way he can get a job despite his America return status is not through merit, but through his father's Marwari network with the company. The newly emerged sacred precincts of modern industry and technological innovation have not abdicated their network within reliance on pre-modern traces of caste and community influences. Jaideep's knowledge of computer software and technology has no takers in his company and the country. Even as he works hard to read numerous files and prepare a 30-page report highlighting the faulty structures and policies of the company, his labor goes waste. Here, Saraugi indirectly suggests how the producer-patriot model began to lose its relevance as the country prepared itself for a liberalized economy from 1970s and 80s onwards. Despite his best efforts to fit himself into the system of the company, he is termed an undisciplined employee just because he demands his tea in a cup, challenging the company's age-old convention of serving tea to its employees in glasses. So, there are a few more examples which I would like to skip here. And what is more interesting here is that there is this also a very strong engagement with the vision, the leftist vision of building a utopia. Considering the fact that this is also the time of the Naxalite movement in Calcutta, and Saraugi suggests that how it is so easy to be angry, to protest, to be violent, or sacrifice oneself for the sake of an ideal. In this case, a social transformation, what is difficult is to stay put, to negotiate with and confront systemic injustices on a daily life. What is even more tragic is to personalize one's suffering to an extent that one loses all hope of improvement. As Jaideep confesses, he is not bold enough to sacrifice himself at an altar of an ideal. And therefore, his life's journey is nothing more than hopping on and off these various professions, which range from working for the Hind Motors company, or investing money in the jute mill, or investing money in the iron ore factory. Then with the globalization and liberalization coming in, investing money in the share market, getting inspired by the Sharad Mehta, Harshad Mehta's dream of an aspiration for improvement. But what is the most important section in this novel is how Saraugi goes on to offer a kind of a historical corrective to the Naxalite movement. What is the difference between those people who actually plunge into the movement and those who stay back? The so-called loyalists. Are these people loyalists, or are also the victims of the state in many other ways? So what sets...
You have just half a minute now, please.
Can I take 2 minutes, please?
Just 5 minutes, please.
Okay, all right. So, yeah, so sure. I would just like to read this encounter that he has with one of his friends, who, despite his involvement in the Naxalite movement, has now been a very senior manager of a corporate company, and Jaideep finds himself lost again with no job, and he goes to give his interview to this company, thinking that he might get a job, but to his dismay and surprise, his friend Devnath is already a senior manager there, and What is important here is this paragraph. He says that सब कुछ करके वे लोग आखिर उन्हीं जगहों पर पहुंच गए थे जहां वे सीधे रास्ते चलते तो पहुंचते। ऊपर से उनके पास सुनाने के लिए एडवेंचर की कहानियां थी। इतनी क्रांतिकारिता उनमें बची थी कि वे अब भी अपने चपरासी से कभी कभार बीड़ी मांगकर सुलगा लेते थे। जैसा कि एक चुटकुला उनके बारे में चलता था, भले वे किसी न किसी एनजीओ को चलाने में लगे हों या किसी बड़ी कंपनी में किसी कुर्सी पर बैठे हों या असीम चैटर्जी की तरह चुनाव में खड़े हों, वे उन्हीं कैपिटलिस्ट और साम्राज्यवादी व्यवस्थाओं के हिस्से बन चुके थे जिनके खिलाफ खूनी नारे लिखकर उन्होंने पूरे कलकत्ते को लाल रंग में रंगा था। न जाने समय ने उनके साथ धोखा दिया था या उन्होंने समय को धोखा दिया था। बदला तो कुछ नहीं था, बल्कि पहले से बदतर हो गया था। Thank you so much.
So thank you, Dr. Bharti. Another very, very interesting paper. So in this session, we have papers from the 17th century to early 20th to mid 70s to two very contemporary Hindi novels, which are also sort of looking back from the Nehruvian juncture to the present. So over to the rapporteurs now. I have made enough comments. We have exactly 10 minutes now for all the question answers. So over to the rapporteurs.
Hello, good evening. I would like to thank you, Professor Albina Shakil, for graciously stepping in, and also to all the presenters of this session. Quickly, we are taking the questions. So the first question is from Ashutosh Agarwal for Ketkar sir, and it's from Zoom chat box. He asks how to read the philosophy of bhakti and samskara as in Anandvan Bhuvan in the narrative of Indian history, which is being swayed by power.
Is it, I don't know who has asked, is it samskara or a sansar? The word that I used was sansar, right? Prapancha, or the worldly affairs of human life. Are you talking about that, or are you talking about samskara, which is a different thing altogether? So I would be happy if you can clarify.
Yes, sir. So Ashutosh wants to ask about samskara, the different word samskara.
Okay. So samskara, I don't think samskara would, again, if you look at the term samskara, it goes back to the Brahminical rites of passage, right? Associated with dvijas usually. And it's about rites of passage, 16 Shodash Sanskara at various points of life. And it's deeply connected with Varna system. And yes, Anandvan Bhuvan is about kind of reviving Varna system. From Varna Sankara, which is the sign of Kali Yuga. So in that sense, it's a revivalist project. And it is connected to the rise of the Maratha power with Shivaji. So, and Shivaji very famously would use very Sanskritized kind of rhetoric to establish his kingship. And and he would very famously also make a kind of manual to translate Yavana word or the Mlech words or the Muslim or the Perso-Arabic words into Sanskrit. So yes, there is something that is part of politics of the time. Yeah, and there is a question from I don't know who, Ramdas, demonizing of the terms as mlechas and his message for very interesting.
Yes,
yeah, there is a question here, I think.
Yes, this is question. Yeah, sure. This is a question from Asuddin sir for use. So you can take that question.
Technically speaking, mlecha is not used for demonization, but it's kind of people who exist outside the Varna system, the Chatur Varna Vedic system. So mlecha would be anyone, Shak or Hunds or whoever, as outsider, the others. How do you reconcile? Well, I think the way we look at it today, from today, sounds polarizing, but there were attempts to kind of find a common ground in that period. And I think one of the evidences is so many santas like Ramdas himself used Hindustani language extensively apart from Marathi, and a lot of Sufis and a lot of Muslim writers as well wrote in Marathi following Advaita tradition. So there is literature, but a kind of Santa Vangmay where Advait is given a lot of importance. So I don't think these binaries are very look very modern. Means as political terminology, Mlech would be anybody who is outside the Varna system. And there is a kind of Vedic revivalism in Ramdas, and it's definitely Brahminical, which is for sure. But at the same time, Ramdas also had Muslim disciples who are very close, and they are part of his sampradaya early onwards. Yeah, and the word Chandal is not to be understood in the Bengali sense of the word Chandal, but more like the Puranic term Chandal as the Antyaja, which he wants to condemn. So yes, it's an exclusivist project, and it's a kind of so the point that I'm trying to make that is the whole project of reviving Hinduism is not as modern as made to be, because there are longer histories at work which I think can explain it not as merely contemporary phenomena. Is something that I would like to maybe draw your attention to. And its rhetoric got recast, reconfigured into the nationalist term. And I use the word old patriotism used by Bailey to describe these forms of proto-nationalism, to use another term. And there is definitely, it's a Varna kind of thing. Yes, one of other arguments that I keep on developing is that Bhakti was not really about destruction of Varna system. It's about overcoming Varna egos in the path of Paramartha, that is the ultimate release, rather than a reflexive kind of restructuring of society that we associate with modern democracy. So it was never on those lines. But I see here there is a kind of shift in the relation between religion as otherworldly and thisworldly, not as binaries, but as kind of, he is basing his philosophy that you should prapancha karava netka, prapancha should be done properly, your family and domestic life. Only then you can have, then you can think of paramarth or the ultimate release. So this kind of reconfiguration of is for me, and the rise of the terms like Maharashtra Dharma, or even practice of writing, or even terms like Rajkaran, which you find, is for me a kind of indicative of early modernity.
Professor Ketkar, I'm really sorry to have to intervene because now we have 4 minutes for all the rest of the 4 panels. So I'm really sorry.
These are complex questions which
yes.
create confusion if they are not addressed at length. Yeah.
So I don't think so we have any more questions. So I would like to hand it over to Professor Albina Shakil to you. I don't think so we don't have any more questions. So yeah, over to you, Professor Shakil.
Okay, I see a question.
Just yes, Albina, I do have a question. This is for Asmat Jahan. I've typed it over here.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, I've typed it over here. Asmat, if she would like to comment on this. Is she here?
Professor Asmat, are you here?
Yeah.
So the question for you is, I don't find utopian sentiment in the progressives. There is desire for azadi and all the goodness it entails, but it's very brief and fraught. I would like your comments.
I don't agree with that. I would still argue that progressives do express utopian sensibility, but there are fragments of utopian imagination that one finds in progressive poetry. And I think a good example of utopian imagination in the progressives is the poem by Faiz Ahmad Faiz, which became so controversial in recent times, Hum Dekhenge. Okay, so that is, I think, I would cite that as the ultimate expression of the progressives' utopian imagination. I hope that answers the question.
Okay, thank you. I will not.
I would also like to point out that the utopian imagination is articulated in progressive poetry, but it's not all encompassing. Okay, so it's not really utopian with reference to women. Okay, so you find an engagement, a representation of women as victims of patriarchy. Okay, so in that sense, the discourse continues to be quite conventional, and it's not truly all encompassing. Okay.
So, okay, thank you. There are lots of unanswered questions, and I'm sure there are many lingering in everybody's minds. We wish this session could go on longer because I have many questions, but I think I have taken too much time as the chair stepping in at the last moment. So, without further ado, I'm passing it on to Dr. Fatima Rizvi to kindly end the session. Thank you to everyone. Dr. Fatima Rizvi.
Thank you, Dr. Shakil, and thank you so much for stepping in with such a short notice. You did a very gracious job of the whole session. I'd like to thank all the panelists for presenting thought-provoking, excellent papers. I'd like to thank our rapporteurs for a very smooth and uneventful conduct of the session. Our entire tech team from JBMC, Tanu Sharma, Anuj Kumar, for their unstinting support and contribution in airing the session. I'd like to thank all our attendees for being so enthusiastically involved with us and with the session. And with this, we'd like to close for this evening. Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks.
We rejoin the next session in 10 minutes, right? So, yes.
Yeah, we will be back
Thank
in
you
10
all.
minutes with the final session of the evening.
Sure.
Okay, thank you.